Welcome back to FinTalk, brought to you by VERMEG. Here we discuss pressing topics in fintech, regtech, covering regulatory, collateral and digital across banking and insurance and finance. VERMEG has been proud to deliver innovative software solutions in the industry with stability and cost efficiency for a global roster of clients. With over 20 years of trusted transformation in finance and insurance, we're bringing industry's top expertise to FinTalk. I'm Gerald Akhtar and I'll be your host for this podcast. Welcome back to FinTalk, brought to you by VERMEG. I'm Gerald Akhtar, your host. So today's session, we're going to be talking a lot more about blockchain, CLTs, CBDCs, all things digital. So today I'm delighted to have with us Martin Warner. Martin, thank you for taking the time out. I know how busy you are. For those that don't know you, it would be great to get an introduction and kind of where you've come from and how you've got to where you are now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the welcome and warm introduction there. So my background is I came from a capital markets and technology background. So I did that for 30 years, working for big banks, working in my own company with customers who are banks, hedge funds, asset managers, etc. And in 2018, I fell down the crypto blockchain rabbit hole. It was a pivotal moment for me to understand what the technology did and how it could potentially change how we work in finance and capital markets. So I'm very much come from an industry background into the blockchain. I've gone deep into the blockchain, and I'm currently working on a project called T-Grade, which we launched in the summer. And it's a level 1 blockchain with a regulatory framework around it to try and address some of the issues that we face in crypto.
Thanks, Martin. It's quite a detailed experience back there. I know VERMEG as a provider, we work with a lot of blockchains as well, and we do connectivities from our software platforms. Just for everyone listening, can we describe what a blockchain is?
Yeah, blockchain is one of those things people can talk about, and you can go very deep very quickly. But essentially, there's two flavors of it. One, I think it's an important distinction to have, is one is run by a set number of institutions generally who connect up to themselves, and they run a closed network. And the other one's the public blockchains, ones you've heard of like Bitcoin, Ethereum, and so on. They work by having a whole network of independent nodes that connect to each other. They form consensus on how a state is kept in a centralized sort of it's distributed ledger, and they all agree on the state of things. And that's the fundamental part of it. So if I sent you an asset, we wouldn't need an intermediary to do that. It would just be, I would send something to you and the network would make sure that transaction happened and the ledger was updated. And that's done through a whole network of, like I say, independent node operators. The independent nodes are important for not just some intellectual concept about decentralization, but it's very, very important for the security of the network, for resiliency, plus censorship resistance as well. So you can't undo these transactions and you can't stop the transactions happening.
So how can firms use it? So I've read about, the bigger banks are starting to use this. I know from VERMEG, we connect into Ethereum and a few other blockchains as well, as we do from our platforms. But from a firm's perspective, how can they utilize this, and is this secure, or is it, you get the typical questions from clients is, how secure is it? How, we're reading all this stuff in the news on all that. How secure is it? But ultimately, how can they utilize it? What's their benefit from connecting to a blockchain?
So I think if we take a step back on the blockchains and think about it, they're built with the open source environment, so they're fully open for anyone to read. And it places them in a very adversarial environment. So people are constantly probing these blockchains to look for structural weaknesses in the software, in the design, and also the economic exploits. And occasionally they find them. Generally, they find them on the application layers rather than the infrastructure itself. So the infrastructure is probably, I would say, some of the most robust infrastructure you'll ever find because of this incessant attacking. People have incentives to attack. They get either paid by bounty bugs or just they're doing it to steal or whatever. So from that point of view, from a business point of view, you're building on a very, very robust layer. What you then do on top of that is the advantage then of having a public ledger is you're sharing information and you're updating records that are held between you all. So in the more traditional worlds, we spend, I don't know how many millions a year reconciling data and clarifying, oh, did you mean that? Was that sent? No, I did that by accident. No, I mean this by this instrument. All of that ambiguity goes away. You know that when you're talking about an interest rate swap held on a blockchain, it's got a taxonomy, it's standardized, and everyone knows they've got the same instrument. So I think those are big advantages. And then there's a massive, massive untapped potential for automation. So a lot of the tasks that we do in institutions at the moment is, we've tried to automate them over decades, but there's still a lot of manual processing. And a lot of this kind of automation can happen in between institutions, and we cut out some of the middle intermediaries. That is done in such a way that you're not introducing any further risk by doing that. So the cryptography and the automation secures it and mitigates the risks that you'd otherwise think would come in.
Yeah, that's interesting, because that helps firms to understand the landscape of how to connect into it and what the benefits are in terms of reconciliations, and knowing everything is standard. I think the idea is having a standard playing field from everyone. It makes life a lot easier. Just to kind of touch upon that now, we talked about blockchain, how firms can utilize it, but then we've been hearing a lot about the CBDC, so the Central Bank Digital Currencies. We've seen the papers released by the UK regulator, India and China obviously leading this discussion as well. How do you see that then playing into this whole new ecosystem?
So I'm a bit mixed about CBDCs, because I think the banks are being a bit quick out of the gun, off the mark, as it were. I don't know, mixing my metaphors here, but they, I think they're jumping on the technology. The technology can do a lot of what they do, but they need to consider an awful lot of other issues. So, from a wholesale point of view, I think it's absolutely brilliant. So, the Bank of England doing transactions with the Bundesbank in Germany, whatever, using a network of digital currency is a really, really quick, nice and easy way of doing things. You get the instant settlement. You don't have the correspondence banks. You don't have all the paraphernalia around that. So from that point of view, I think it's a really good way of doing things. It can be all controlled by the Bank of International Settlements. You can do transfers amongst each other. You could even introduce some of the DeFi concepts of automated market makers. So BIS would create liquidity pools, and people could then swap currencies back and forth. So I'm quite a fan of that. Where I'm less of a fan of, and you hear glimpses of it for the retail side of things, is you suddenly have an entity that can track and trace everybody's spending, which is a bit of a problem, because you're trying to balance that with your right to enjoy some freedoms on, keeping some of that private. How I spend my money is at the moment is my business. Yes, some private companies understand from my credit card transactions what I'm doing. Some shops keep data on what I did. Websites keep whatever they do, but no one has the overall picture. But if a central bank, started monitoring addresses, exactly, they would know that I bought a newspaper at 10 o'clock that morning. I then went and bought a cappuccino half an hour later, and so on and so forth. And my spending patterns are then open to be traced by central bank, who would probably have an idea of who that address belongs to, because they would insist on some kind of AML, KYC onboarding. So that's where I think there's a lot more debate needed.
And there's two thoughts to this, isn't it? It's very big brother kind of look onto it, but also it controls the shocks in the market, right? We can see what's happening, hopefully foresee any potential issues in the market, and can kind of address those quickly. So yeah, I think there is a lot more discussion that needs to happen. My sense is that they're trying to jump on this quite quickly, because they feel like they've been so late to the market in crypto, and it's just kind of run away. This kind of becomes a bit more control. And also the other thing that is quite interesting for me is, we look at CBDCs, but also if we look at when we talk about crypto, it's still new, still unregulated, it's still a huge amount of risk. There's no real history behind it. But then we look at the digital securities, how that has a bit more, the old traditional format, but going into a digital method, how that still has its historical viewpoints. It feels a bit more safer. How do you see the crypto versus digital kind of environment playing out?
I think we do have some quite handy legislation around. So if you think about the e-money licenses, so when people talked about digital currencies before blockchain came along, it was about electronic money transfers for enabling e-commerce. So, like the European laws on e-money has been well established for many years, and that's what the likes of PayPal and Revolut and all those guys use. So, I think if we can use that as a framework to say, well, we've got something that's established, it's well understood. So that's probably a better model for digital currencies than, say, trying to invent the thing from scratch, because like the e-money thing works. You know what the capital requirements are, you know what the licensing are, you know what the infrastructure is, how you set it up, what the fit and proper people are, etc. So I think that's if we're a bit smart in how we work on this, there are bits of frameworks we can use that are well tested and tried. It's not we've got a blank piece of paper here.
Yeah, it's a fair point around e-money, actually. I still think there's a lot to do in terms of bringing that whole kind of framework together. And just kind of touching on that now, obviously we've seen the recent FTX fiasco. How has that impacted the market? And obviously there's, that, is it I told you so, or the market lost confidence in crypto, or, I mean, you saw Bitcoin value drop massively, but so yeah, it'd be interesting to hear from your point of view on that.
Well, I think the problem is it's 2022 has been the most horrible year for crypto. We've seen wave after wave of particularly bad news, and we started off in the summer with the spectacular collapse of of Luna Terra, and watching how a stablecoin can very, very rapidly unravel. And it unraveled for a very good reason, is that the model itself was fundamentally flawed. The way it was done, it wasn't, it just took someone with a bit of research to figure out how to break the bridge, which is what people always do. They try and break pegs. George Soros famously did it, and the ERM system, So there's a long history of all this sort of stuff, and people will, where there's a peg, probe where the weaknesses are. And if your economic model doesn't stand up, you get found out. So you contrast that with MakerDAO and their DAI product. God, that's robust. It's got vaults, it's got collateral, it's got margin, it's got auto liquidations, and people hammer it and hammer it and hammer it, and it still stands up, and you can throw anything at it. It's bulletproof. So that's the contrast between the models. So it's not that crypto's bad in itself. And then, that started really looking at what crypto did in the summer. And then we have FTX come along. Now, FTX was, I don't think we've really seen everything that's come out yet. We've got glimpses of a very poorly managed company, no checks and balances, one person sort of, I'm not sure it's done intentionally. It may have been, it may not have been. I'm not one to judge. But when you've got such poor governance, no segregation of duty, no real clarity about what your customer assets are for, how you use them, etc., then that's not good. So I think my assessment of crypto at the moment is we're staggering around punch drunk. There's still stuff coming out. Is Genesis in trouble? Is Silver Lake in trouble? There's questions around all the institutions. And naturally, it's a nice crisis and people use it as an opportunity. Don't waste a crisis, they say. So it's more nuanced than just the told you so. I think there's always that brigade. People have always said, crypto is there for criminals and Ponzi scheme or whatever, and they're not going to change their minds. And this is further ammunition for them to say, look, the whole thing should just disappear. You've then got a kind of, I wouldn't call it regulatory backlash, but there is regulators being asked some serious questions like, it was on your watch, what did you do? And so a knee jerk there might be a bit of fortuitous lobbying from the incumbents to say, come on, guys, crack down on them. Make them do our rules to put out the barriers to entry, and we'll stop some of this stealing of our territory, as it were. Strangely, you've got the decentralized finance lot who are, they revel in being fully decentralized, autonomous, anonymous where possible. They have taken a strange view on this by just basically saying, wouldn't have happened with us because, like the example I gave of DAI, it's fully automated, and they have a point. However, they work in a bubble. their world isn't really connected to anything else. But at some point, regulations will need to touch them. And isn't it better for them to have meaningful conversations and educate regulators and work together with the legislators and regulators to say, look, this is what our stuff can do. This is mitigating these issues that you have, these concerns you have, and let's work together to get sensible frameworks out. The alternative is the regulators just drop regulations on them and they squeal because they had no input. So that's another dynamic going on as well. And then you've got the large centralized exchanges. They have an agenda as well to say, look, we're well run. We would never do anything like FTX. We welcome licenses, further regulation, because it gives them a competitive advantage. They've already established themselves. They won't get pushed out by startups because, it's costly to get the compliance departments put together, the capital requirements and so on, but the big players can already do that. So let's say it's quite complex of who's jostling for what at the moment, but like I say, the industry is staggering punch drunk.
Yeah, that's a fair point. To me, seeing that, I mean, FTX is just one example, right? There's been multiple this year. Yeah, you're right. I think we've all forgotten about that, and FTX has taken the stage really. But that my impression is that it would have at least kicked the regulators into a bit more. Let's hurry this along, because it's not going anywhere. It's here to stay. That's quite obvious. And just to kind of add to that, your opinion actually on the regulatory landscape and the horizon between, obviously now we're looking into 2023 and beyond. Where do you see that lying, for yourself and, for your industry, and how it will work, or how do you plan it, or how would you want to see it coming together?
Well, I think in Europe, we've seen the very welcome MiCA Act. It's not perfect, but what it does do, it's an EU regulation. So that means it goes across the 27. It's not a directive that the national parliaments can tweak and amend and adapt to their own benefits. This is across Europe. So that means you've got regulatory certainty right across the block. So it means you have, full passporting. If you register in one country, that gives you a market of 400 odd million people. So that's a fairly good starting point. The travel rule directive as well is coming in, which also gives a bit more certainty around what your anti-money laundering objectives are, et cetera. So I welcome things like that because at least you know what rules you're playing in. There's also quite a lot of movement as well from ESMA, looking at the DLT pilot scheme. The UK is doing the same. They're doing sensible consultations, working with the industry to come up with laws and rules around this. I think the big elephant in the room is what the US does. It's at state level. They're using strange legislation to regulate them. There's retrospective powers of the SEC to suddenly turn around and say, no, you were a security all along, we'll give you a fine. And it's all tested in the courts. That's a nightmare if you're in crypto. You want certainty. You don't want this, aren't I breaking the law today? Or, was that yesterday I was breaking the law by accident? I didn't know about it. And so on. Yeah. So I think I welcome some kind of regulatory certainty.
Martin, thank you for that. And kind of lastly, what's the plans for next year for you and your firm?
So we've got a blockchain that is regulatory friendly. So we put some mechanisms in that help businesses basically create a corner of the blockchain for themselves that they're in charge of, and they know who's on board, and they can comply with money laundering, anti-money laundering, KYC, etc. regulations. Why it's interesting is we're getting quite a few businesses with some really interesting ideas of what they can use the technology for. So we're very much a business-focused chain, and we've seen, I would say in the last couple of months, more activity than ever. People are thinking about it. So in some ways, popping the bubble of all that speculative frenzy and, arguably what people are calling Ponzi schemes is actually quite healthy, because it means that the serious players now get a bit of oxygen to come and develop and do and make and build things. And it'll become, I think, quite a virtuous circle, because as all the various players come on board, they'll be building tools they need. So we'll solve some of the custody issues. We'll solve some of maybe even the regulatory reporting aspect of it. we'll get more clarity of that from the regulators, and so on. So I think it's I'm very optimistic for next year, even though we've got all the signs of a big crypto winter. I think that some of that froth disappearing from the market is actually very healthy.
Yeah, it's going to be a winter of discontent, isn't it, from crypto point of view? But yeah, you're right, and I know we're going to be talking a lot more in the future between how we talk to each other softwares. Martin, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for that. I know we're definitely going to have more sessions and go far deeper into this. I think it's a really interesting topic to cover, Martin. So thank you so much, Martin. Have a good Christmas.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me. Merry Christmas to you too.